Hello again. I only played in one game this week, on Wednesday in Fitchburg. On Thursday I was a little bit tired, so I decided to sleep instead of playing chess. So I only have one game to bring to you this week. I had the white pieces, and I was playing against a gentleman named Diego Ubiera, who's rated in the high 1900s, I believe. It was the fifth and final round of the tournament, and I was sitting at a score of 4 out of 4, and my closest competitors, including Diego, were at 3 out of 4. So getting at least a draw in this game would secure me first place. I played d4. Yeah. He did not play all of those moves. He played knight f6, and after c4, g6, knight c3, d5. We have an opening that we've seen a surprising number of times on this channel so far, called the Grunfeld. Knight f3 from white. Oh, here comes one of my cats already. Bishop g7 from black, and I went into what I think I have pointed out in the past on this channel is called the Russian variation of the Grunfeld. D takes c4, queen takes c4, castle kingside. And the idea behind this variation for white is that he gets in e4 really quickly without allowing black to trade the knight on f6 for the knight on c3. I say really quickly, I don't know why I say that. The point is not to get it in quickly, but to get it in without that trade. And so white's idea is that he has almost as much of a center as he has in the normal Grunfeld, except that black has not been allowed to trade a pair of minor pieces, which white hopes favors him. Diego played a6, and I played bishop d3. Thinking that I was remembering a piece of opening theory, which involved him playing b5, which he did, and then after queen b3 and his c5, I thought I was supposed to put something on the c2 square, either my queen or the bishop. Okay, I've gone back and looked at that now, and it turns out that I totally made that up, and that this is actually a really bad position for white, as Diego pointed out after the game. And that's because I can't take the pawn on c5, or I'll drop my bishop on d3. And black is threatening just to advance the pawn to c4 with a fork. And if I take care of that fork and protect my pieces with a move like queen c2, which is what I played in the game, black wins a pawn on d4. So, going back for a sec, I guess in this position, I either had to play what Diego recommended after the game, which is the move e5, possibly intending to play e6 afterwards, or I had to play something calmer, let's say bishop e2, something that doesn't walk into bad tactics. Yikes, my face looks really washed out. I think this is going to be a horrible video. But anyway, bishop e2. Okay, so I played bishop d3. Diego played b5, queen b3, c5, and now I'm in a little bit of trouble because I seem to be dropping this pawn on d4. Queen c2, c takes d4, knight e2, and alright, I've got a bunch of pressure on it, and I seem to be adequately defending the pawn on e4, so maybe I'll get the pawn back. But Diego played an interesting move here, knight g4. And at this point, if he manages to get in the move e5, he's going to be protecting his pawn on d4, and then he just has a protected passed pawn for the foreseeable future, which is obviously not good for white. I don't think it quite works out this way, so let's say I castle and he plays e5. I think I have h3 here, which recovers the pawn, possibly. For example, knight h6, bishop takes h6, bishop takes h6, removes the defender of e5, and knight takes e5 gets the pawn back. But I'm not sure I saw this during the game, but even if I did, I probably would have found it unattractive because it gives up the two bishops, and in particular gives up the bishop that matches my opponent's fianchettoed kingside bishop. So after knight g4, I played h3. And this seems to be exactly what black wants because he wants to stick the knight on e5. And it sort of is, but I had the idea that I could then trade that knight off and play f4. And this was my way of trying to stop black from getting in the move e5. bishop back to g7, and castle kingside. Okay, so if you count the pawns, you'll notice that black still has one more than white, and that white is not close to being able to take the pawn on d4. It's defended twice, and only attacked once. Not to mention that the white king is on the a7 g1 diagonal, which means that even if I attack this pawn enough times to take it back, I may end up getting one of my pieces pinned on that diagonal, which may cost me material. So I'm down a pawn, and it's not looking like I'm going to get it back, which means I have to find some kind of compensation for it. And my idea was maybe I can expand on the king side, and let's get rid of these arrows. Expand on the king side, have a stronger, let's say more space-gaining center than black, and claim that I have some kind of advantage of activity with two minor pieces, a queen and a rook already developed against black's bishop and arguably queen. Diego played bishop to b7. And one option here is to go b3 and then stick the bishop either on b2 or a3. The d3 square has my pieces on it for now, so the d4 pawn is blockaded, which means black will have a hard time revealing an attack on the rook on a1. But since I was down a pawn, and since I thought that my compensation for that should be some kind of a kingside attack, taking advantage of my lead in development and my extra kingside space, I tried to move my pieces toward the kingside, and I played knight g3. Alright, at this point, I want to develop the dark square bishop somewhere, maybe g5 or f4. And at some point I want to play the move f5, possibly also h4, h5, and start to break down the black pawn center. Diego played knight d7, queen to e2. So I've got a little bit of a problem here, which is that the black rook is going to show up on c8. And I have the additional problem that if I play f5, I walk right into giving black the e5 square. So I settled on getting my queen out of the way with queen e2, but this allows an immediate knight c5. The queen previously was protecting the c5 square. And now if I retreat my light squared bishop, I run the risk that there's going to be the move d3 for black. So I kind of have to leave it there, but that means that black gets to trade a pair of minor pieces when he's up material, and in particular gets to take one of my bishops off the board. So things are looking pretty good for black at this point. Bishop d2, knight takes d3, queen takes d3. All right, but I still have a little bit of compensation, I guess, in the form of more space in the king side, on the king side and in the center, and a little bit better piece development. Diego played queen b6, which puts the queen on the same diagonal as the white king, and I played h4. And again, the idea is to put pawns on h5 and f5 and try to cause enough of a weakening to black's kingside pawn structure that I can break in there with my pieces and deliver checkmate or win a bunch of material. Queen to e6 is an interesting move. And I think Diego's idea was that he wants to try to exploit the g4 square, which is now weak. And if the queen can sit on g4, it's going to be very hard for me to remove it without offering a trade of queens. And black wouldn't mind a trade of queens because he's already up material, and he has the two bishops, which are going to be nice in an endgame. And it seems like I'm about to attack his king, which means maybe it would be safer for him not to have the queens on the board. So I played f5, cutting the queen off from g4, and he played queen d6. Again, an interesting move. And now he's putting some pressure on this knight on g3, which so far is fine because it's protected by the queen on d3. But black can now add the bishop on e5 to that diagonal and put enough pressure on this knight on g3 that it's going to be, well, actually won't be that hard for me to defend it. I can play rook f3. But it'll at least tie me down a little bit, and it's not clear how I'm going to continue with my attack. Whereas if I play bishop f4, black can play bishop e5 and trade off these minor pieces, which might be a goal of his, given that he's up this passed pawn on d4. Although it's arguable because this bishop on g7 is the only minor piece defending the black king. But I came up with a different idea, and that's to play rook to f4. I'm going to defend the knight on g3 with the rook, but my idea is that after bishop e5, I'm going to defend from g4 instead of f3, because g4 puts more pressure on the black king. And were black to play h5 here, it would turn out that that pawn is not defended and can immediately be captured by the knight on g3 because of the pin along the g-file. Diego played rook a to c8. I played h5. Again here, I think black's position is very good, and white's, at least practical way to try to come back into the game is to attack the black king. Diego played g5 here, and this is kind of a critical moment. I've been hoping so far over the course of the game that black will make some kind of weakening kingside pawn move, so that my attack will be helped out. And g5 is one of the moves I was hoping he would make. But he's making it now because it's being done at a time when my dark squared bishop is not hitting g5. And now if I play rook g4, he will defend this g-pawn with one of his others, let's say h6. And it's not clear what my rook is doing on g4. Well, it is clear. It's doing absolutely nothing. And black has kind of solidified things on the king side, and now he's just up a pawn and the two bishops, and my rook is misplaced on g4, and he's going to use the c-file, and I'm dead. So I retreated my rook instead to the f3 square. And here, the point is sort of that it's not easy for black to figure out how now to defend this pawn on g5. If he defends it with f6, that's obviously bad for the bishop on g7. And if he defends it with h6, as he did in the game, I have this interesting move, f6. Freeing the f5 square for the white knight, and hoping to shut down this bishop on g7. At this point, if he takes with the bishop, which is the most natural way to recapture here, after all, black doesn't really want to block this bishop in with e takes f6. The move knight f5 forks the queen on d6 and the h6 pawn, and at least offers white some hope of following through with this attack and getting at the black king. Obviously, the queen can't take because the rook is guarding that pawn. And this maybe is the major difference between having the rook on f3 as opposed to g4. So Diego did play e takes f6, and that gives me the f5 square for the knight. In fact, it gives it to me with tempo. But as I looked at this position a little bit more, I realized that, and maybe Diego realized this before I did, that it's actually very hard for white to use the f5 square for the knight here. And that's because it weakens, critically, the pawn on e4. For example, after knight f5, which comes with tempo, black will probably just stick his queen on e5. And now white doesn't want to trade on g7, as the whole point of this pawn sack, this extra pawn sack on f6, was that it weakened this bishop on g7 and made the knight good. So now trading those two minors would be a strategically very bad idea. But black is threatening to take this pawn on e4. And how do I defend it? My rook on f3 can't defend from either the f-file or the e-file. So rook e1 is the only way. And then there would be some move for black with a rook to attack that pawn again. And though it's arguable that there might be some kind of downside for black in taking that pawn because of the pin along the e-file, it's at least attacked more times now than it's defended. And the only way for white to defend it again is to move the knight back to g3. So it turns out that this nice outpost for the knight on f5 can't really be used because the knight is needed to defend the weak pawn on e4. So I played rook f5 instead, hoping to reactivate the rook to keep this bishop on g7 hemmed in behind its pawn on f6, to keep the knight supporting the pawn on e4, and maybe at some point this rook on f5 will coordinate with the queenside rook either along the f-file or the c-file. Diego played rook f to e8, and I played a3, just a little improving move, hoping to bring this dark squared bishop more into the game. He played rook to e5. Yeah, and I don't think trading here is a good idea because I'm already down material, and allowing black to put a pawn on e5 will secure this protected passed pawn on d4. And yes, he still has a bad bishop on g7, but it can be activated at some point with bishop to f8. So I retreated my rook to f2, and with black's rook on e5, the queen can't go there, which, by the way, was another reason I put the rook on f5 to begin with. It stops queen e5. Diego played rook d8. And all right, around here I was thinking that white had very serious compensation for the lost material. And that's because this bishop's not very good, because this bishop has the option to use queenside dark squares. This knight hopes to use the f5 outpost at some point. And the rooks are going to be pretty good, almost anywhere I put them. The c file, the f file, the e file, the d file. Rook c1, queen to e6, bishop a5, sort of hoping that black would pile up on this e-pawn so that I can take this dangerous passed d-pawn off the board. But Diego played rook d7, which I think is good. And here I was going to play the move bishop c7. Because the rook, it turns out, has nowhere to go. It can't go to the c file because that's protected by the rook, and of course both of its light squares are protected, and if it advances, it'll be captured by the knight. But I think it turns out that it being captured by the knight is actually quite good for black. I was thinking during the game that after rook takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and then some queen move. Let's just put the queen on d2. Black can play f5, securing the bishop on e4, waking up the g7 bishop on the long diagonal, and in the process protecting this passed pawn on d4. And this just looks crushing in black's favor to me, or at least it did during the game. So I can't play bishop c7 yet. I had to play rook e2, with the idea to defend the pawn a third time, at which point bishop to c7 is threatened. But queen g4. Yeah, Diego found a lot of good moves in this game, so kudos to him. This move releases the e6 square so that the rook can now move back to e6 if it wants to, puts some pressure on h5, keeps the pressure on e4, and puts the queen off to the side so that when the captures start on that square, black can take on e4 with the queen last if he wants to. And it puts some pressure on this knight on g3 and on the rook on e2. It's a very nice square for the queen. Rook to c7. Okay, I had two major options here. Bishop c7 or rook c7. Bishop c7, though, now just allows black to play rook e6, and I'm not sure what I've accomplished, apart from putting my bishop in danger. So I played rook to c7. Oh, and another thing to note is that Diego at this point had very little time on his clock. He was down to just a couple minutes, or maybe less than a minute at this point. Rook takes c7, bishop takes c7, rook c5. Okay, and here I only have, as far as I could tell, one move that doesn't put me into big trouble. If I play, what was I going to play originally? I was going to make some bishop move, I believe. I don't remember exactly, but if I make some move like bishop a5 or bishop b6, what was I going to play? Because there was some... Oh, yeah, okay. I was thinking about queen takes d4 here. With the idea that if black takes on c7, I have queen d8 check, picking up the rook on c7, protecting the knight on g3, which is protecting the rook on e2, and they're both protecting the pawn on e4. So I thought this might be a tactical way to get back in the game. The problem is that after queen takes d4, black has rook c1 check. And things look pretty ugly here for white. If king h2, queen h4 is checkmate. And sadly, if king f2, queen f4 is checkmate. Isn't it? No, it says check. What's going on? Oh, I didn't see this during the game, but the bishop can just take on f4. Whoops. Well, I thought I'd be mated if I went to f2 here. Okay, but anyway, I didn't play this. I played rook c2, defending the bishop on c7. And black traded rooks, and after queen takes, the queen is guarding the bishop's guarding the knight and queen are guarding the pawn. The queen is guarding the d1 square and the e2 square, which otherwise might be used by the queen on g4. And black had so little time on his clock here that I think I had realistic chances to win on time. Queen back to d7, bishop to a5, and d3. Black begins to push this past d-pawn. Queen d2, queen d4 check. Okay, so black's queen is now far superior to white's, and black has just added a second attacker to the pawn on e4. If I just move away somewhere, let's say king h1, black will play bishop takes e4, protecting this pawn on d3, and the position is pretty hopeless for white. So I played queen to f2, and this, at least for one move, prevents bishop takes e4, because it would drop the queen on d4. Queen c4 from Diego, basically just renewing the threat of taking on e4, but also maybe thinking about putting the queen on c1 with check. Queen to e3, protects the e-pawn, protects the c1 square, and still keeps an eye on d2. Bishop f8, okay, so when I played queen e3, I was imagining that black might want to play f5 with the idea to stick the bishop on d4, winning the queen. And I thought, oh no, I'll just play knight takes f5, hitting the bishop, covering the d4 square, maybe getting back into the game a little bit here. So Diego just put the bishop on f8 instead. And this is a serious problem for white, because he's threatening bishop c5, which has the same effect. And if I try to keep the dark squared bishops on the board while defending against that threat by playing bishop b6, black will go for his other threat, which is to put the bishop on the b8 h2 diagonal, and then just take the knight on g3 off the board. You might argue that trading those two minor pieces, even if it wins the pawn on e4 for black, is not a good idea because it causes a bishops of opposite color situation. But since the queens are still on the board, and since black has this passed pawn on d3, and since the white king is more vulnerable than the black one, I think that kind of position would just be winning for black. Black would destroy white on the light squares, or queen a pawn. So I played bishop b4 instead, which covers c5 and d6, but unfortunately allows the trade of dark squared bishops. Bishop takes b4, a takes b4. All right, and there's still a bit of hope here, because black might take on b4, allowing me maybe to grab his passed pawn on d3, and then hope for some kind of counterplay with queen d8 check, and there might be a knight f5 check, and there might be a queen takes f6. And again, Diego had very little time here, probably something like 15 or 20 seconds at this point. He declined, or maybe it was a little bit more actually. He played queen c2 instead, declining my offer to eat up my bad pawns and give me counterplay. I played knight f1 because he's threatening d2, d1. Queen e2, another nice move. And now if I trade queens, after d takes e2, my king would normally be in time to stop the pawn, but unfortunately the pawn is not only threatening to queen on e1, but to grab the knight on f1. And if I move my knight away, that gives the pawn time to queen. So I played queen d4. And maybe now I'll come to f6, or I'll come to d8. Get counterplay that way. Diego played bishop takes e4. You could also play queen takes e4. I think both of these positions are obviously very good for black. But he chose the way that kept the queens on the board, which is to his credit in a way, because it takes a lot of courage. I'm rated something like 200 points higher than he is, or almost that. So to be willing to keep things tactical when you have very little time on your clock is not an easy idea to go for. Bishop takes e4, and Diego's now threatening queen g2 checkmate. So knight e3. Blocking this checkmate on g2, and cutting off the queen on e2's defense of the bishop on e4. So maybe now I'll get to grab this bishop. And my idea was that if black now plays d2, I can grab this bishop on e4, and after d1 queen, I'll have queen e8 check, when after king h7, because if the king goes to g7, there's going to be knight f5 check, followed by forced mate. So after king h7, queen takes f7 check, and then queen f8 to f7 to f8 to f7, perpetual check. Unfortunately, that's not what would have happened in that variation, because after d2, as Diego played in the game, if queen takes e4, it turns out d1 check. d1 queen comes with check. And grabbing that queen with the knight doesn't even allow me to trade my knight for the pawn, because I'll drop the queen on e4. Okay, at this point, Diego was down to 10 or 15 seconds, and he eventually got down to 8 seconds. But that turned out to be enough time for him to blitz out all the moves and eventually trade queens in a way that... Actually, let's go back here, sorry. I didn't take the bishop on e4. He eventually was able to trade off the queens, and to do so at a time when it won my knight, and he did so with 8 seconds on his clock. So, great job to him. He ended up winning the game. And that means I didn't get the draw or better I needed to secure sole first place, which means I tied for first with Diego. It also means, and this is a little bit more important to me, that it wiped out my rating gain for the tournament. I scored 4 out of 5, and my rating went from 2146 to 2146. But that's what you get when you play regularly against opponents you outrate. Okay, I hope to do better in the next tournament. I skipped my game on Thursday, which means I got a bye there, a half-point bye, and I'm sitting at 1.5 out of 2. We'll see who I play next week. Thanks for watching.